So, can you give us a sense of what they study? What is relevant to Europe about India? 18th century, 19th century.
It's very difficult to generalize, but for us, when we try to understand contacts as intercultural contacts, religion was the crucial theme, subject. Because Europeans, based on their own history, our forefathers, more than 1000, sometimes even 1500 years of Christianity in Europe, religion is the prominent factor in European culture, has been and is today, despite the wish of several liberal and Marxist thinkers. Religion will disappear. It didn't. Even it didn't disappear in Europe, in the US. No. So there, when Europeans come to India, or came to India 17th, 18th century, when they start to really make sense of what is happening, there are different festivals, there are rituals there. Brahmins have certain esteem in some traditions. How to make sense of all that is going on? The connecting point was always religion. Because the question framed by the Christian understanding of the world was, what is this religion here? How does it frame laws of people, habits, practices, all ethical domain, morals, all domains of life? Because this is what religion did in Europe.
So you're saying that the Christian experience was that religion shaped all dimensions of life.
Yes.
And so when they started studying India, they looked for religion because they expected that religion will have shaped all dimensions of life in India as well.
Exactly.
What did they find?
Yeah, in the beginning there was lots of puzzlement. Yet the guiding idea was, apart from Muslims and Christians, and they knew also about Parsis, but they were discovering that the majority of Indian society is not either of these. Christian story tells you, so those would be heathens, pagans. Which for many people is a simple way how to talk about worshippers of different statues, stones, cows, trees. But basically it's a worship of false gods, right?
The heathens worship
false gods. That's the main framework. In the early Christianity, there was a debate with the cults and traditions of Roman Empire, and they defended themselves, delegating all of these deities to the realm of false gods. We have the true God. God of the Bible is the only true God, the deity which created all of us and everything there is. We should obey Him, we should do things properly, and all rest is idolatry. All rest is false religion. So they didn't have, in fact, much chance to think otherwise. Nobili is one of the exemptions. He tried to build on another story from Christianity. He tried to look at Brahmins and other thinkers, as philosophers. And Nobili tried to say, people, these rituals and these habits and practices, they do not pertain to religion really. This is civil domain. This is a domain of civil society. We can leave it as it is. Doesn't matter. We should even accept it.
Accept it. Let it be.
Inter-Indos, Hindu be among Indians, you should be as Indian, otherwise we won't spread the message of Christ. He tried. Few others tried. But that was not really picking up. And the dominant approach was, this is heathendom, there's hardly anything good in it. If there is, these are the remnants of this old good religion that once all humankind had. But that what we see today, it is a very degenerated, very poor state of religion. Hence, implication, very poor state of law, morals, culture, science, everything.
So India became, was characterized by poor state of law, morals,
Yes.
culture,
Yes.
because of the way they saw Indian religion.
Yes.
But then why would they be interested in studying Indian religion at all then? It was just heathenism, so one could just reject it and that was all.
Theoretically you could do that, but as the colonial powers took more and more land in India, they realized first, we won't turn them to Christians that easily. Many missions tried and the attempt failed. So much so that Arthur Schopenhauer in 1840s, after reading Asiatic Journal and some other reports from India, he was telling the British failed miserably in India. That Christian mission in India failed miserably. Majority of people remain as they are, and even those who converted, in fact, are still going on with all their rites and practices. So it's a failure. All right, we are ruling them. We want to rule them. So how to rule them? You have to somehow understand what's going on. This was a challenge for William Jones as a lawyer. How can I decide in courts for these people if I don't understand?
So it's from the law perspective that Jones is interested in India.
Well, he had other interests. When he was on his ship to India, he already in his diary marked 10 areas of interest. He had really a research plan, you can say, very broad. Oh, he was into many things, Indian history, Indian this, Indian music even he wanted to study. And he started, many things he started, but one of the main questions is connected with religion, how it developed, what it really is.
So they had to study the religion in order to understand all these other dimensions of life in India. And yet you said earlier that this was an expectation they had, that religion is what guides laws, morality, culture, etc. So it may not have been the case, in fact, that they had to study religion in order to understand law.
Now we have good reasons after research that has been done by Professor Bala Gangadhar and others to say that we hardly can talk about domestic religion. Of course, Islam, Judaism, Christianity in India, that's an interesting story in itself, but the so-called Hindu religion
doesn't seem to hold the story. Can you tell us about, let's say, the impact that this background story of understanding religion in order to understand law had on the way that the British studied Indian law and the consequences of that?
There were a few things. The first question was practical. Should we keep the law as it is? Now, in fact, it itself is a problem. Because when William Jones wanted to systematize what he saw as an absolute mess in the courts.
He saw Indian law as a mess.
Yeah, he saw it as a mess because he took part in the court in Calcutta. He was a judge there, and they needed, when it was a Muslim law, it was more easy because they still could follow this or that particular law school of Sharia. So fine. Then at least they saw a certain consistency, and in fact they were studying it for some time in Europe, Islamic law. So they could orient themselves in the judgments, in the way trial went, these things. But when the so-called Hindu people came in front of, they called Pandits. It was a question whom to identify as people who should decide properly. Because there were many groups and communities, and some communities didn't like this or that particular Pandit, why he should be helping us to do the decision. It was not clear. But second, even when these Pandits were accepted, their decisions were in Jones' eyes and mind contradictory. Particular case looked into him as the very same case that we did 3 months ago. This chap is deciding a very different thing. A very different judgment came from the decision of the Pandits. To him it was absolutely random or arbitrary decision. So after some time he and others decided we should not allow that. We should systematize, or we should make a standard law that will be just. The question of justice, which is very important there. It was the point. So he started to translate Manu Samhita. This will be the standard. Manava Dharma Shastra, this is the standard Hindu law. And we today should even ask questions whether Manava Dharma Shastra could be taken as something even remotely connected to European structure of law and what law should do in society. Right? So that's one practical problem. But there was a second issue. Once they started to apply it, they realized many of these things that Manava Dharma Shastra contains doesn't look like law at all. There is talk about brahmacharya, what brahmachari should do, how he should obey his teacher, how he is rising up in the morning, what is he even wearing, begging, all these things. There is a discussion what sannyasi should do, the ascetic, what the householders should do, many things that in eyes of Europeans again, is some habits and local practices, why should we keep it? So they started to cut off. William Jones still suggested, leave it. It's full of problems and superstition, but leave it. This is how they are only able to function. Next generations were more critical about it, more harsh. So they started to say, this is not law, this is not law. Leave it. And instead they instituted more of the laws of the British nature. British law was instituted. So in the half of the 19th century, only very few things left from the original Manu applied as a law to Indian society.
So if I understand the story correctly, the Europeans felt intuitively that if they have to understand law, they must understand religion. So they go into a study of religious practices but also law. And they are very dissatisfied with the way that legal practice was going about in India. Laws are being implemented in India. And so they look for a text that can be the law book
source
of the Hindus.
Yes.
And they find the Manusmriti.
Exactly.
And now having found the law book of the Hindus, they edited it heavily and only chose a few elements from that book and put in British law to cover the rest. So that is how what we call Hindu law was actually born. So in that sense, they didn't find the religion to answer their question at all. They just found a book that they could use as an answer.
Exactly.
Okay. And was it successful? The search for religion in India, what kind of directions did it take? Or what kind of scholarship did it produce about India?
That's an important question. Because today we talk about Hinduism, right? We talk about it as a very peculiar religion, but still a religion of a sort. And this is both in academia and popular discourse. The dominant religion of India today is Hinduism. When you look back into the 18th century, this is where the world emerged at the end of the 18th century. Even a word Hinduism was only emerging. But the more important is what it should be. So, Europeans started to ask about God and gods in India, about what they perceived what should be worshipped, right? And even those Orientalists like William Jones, he in one letter is writing, I am in love with Krishna and Gopiya, and these things.
William Jones.
William Jones. So you can't say just black and white. He was liking many things here, apparently. But the more important is how he could understand domestic practices, domestic thinking connected to these practices. That is the main question. And his education, plus his still very Christian beliefs about the world, were telling him a very different story, a very European story. story of the one true God who is communicating with people in every part of the world. This God is biblical God, no doubt, has certain particular features which are very aligned to Indian traditions. And this God was also communicating with Indians in the remote past. So, in this or that way, they had a sense of one true God. But then, priests came into the picture. First, they did a good job, but they started to devise rituals, and they were very much enjoying the power the position is given to them in the society. We should always remember this is a European story, reflecting the experience with the Western Church, especially Roman Church, and it includes the Protestant criticism of the role of the priests in the Church. So, this story became a general pattern for looking at India too. And then these priests must have, according to this story, degenerated, spoiled the religion. Some of these early Orientalists even talk about faked revelation. Instead of having these traces of this original, true, proper knowledge of this one God, they started to invent more and more and more. This is how religion degenerated. And I did a research where I can talk much more in detail how this pattern became discussed by several generations of the British Orientalists, how it was picked up by French and German and other Orientalists in Europe, and finally created the common story of Vedism, its degeneration into Brahmanism, and then later how Buddhists and others fought it. So for a while Brahmins had to do things to get them in, and finally Hinduism emerged. This is a dominant story today. But without the background of Christian assumptions about the one true God, about history of humankind, and about the specific role of priesthood, this story even doesn't make sense. It's empty. Semantically, it's an empty story.
Why do you need Christian assumptions to understand the story?
Because then you would not have any grounds to ask a question whether your forefathers knew of this true biblical God. First of all, you must believe there is such a being. You must believe that all the biblical story and all the biblical claims about this being, how he communicated with the humankind, are true. You must believe many items in the Christian theology, in the Christian explanation of the history of the world, also how it developed. What happened, there is the flood. And what happened after flood, when only one family in fact was again the source of populating the earth. This is what William Jones still took as a serious description of human history, world history. He is in fact saying, because Puranas were puzzling for him. They gave a time span that was too much for 18th century Europeans. They still believed that the world was going on for not even 6,000 years from the creation, right? Puranas are talking of millions and myriads of years. So to him it was far too much. And in one part he even is saying literally, would we accept that some of this what is happening here in India in their description is true, then we have to say our religion is false. It will fall apart. So I have to keep believing this is true.
So you're saying that the Orientalists had biblical assumptions when they were studying India.
Yes, indeed.
And one strain of that biblical assumption is that the Indians must have had revelation through the one true God in some form
in some
or
way,
the
yes.
other.
Either through the progeny of Noah or people like Zephaniah Holwell, one of the predecessors before Jones. He had a particular story about Brahma being originally an angel.
An angel.
Angel coming from this biblical God with and giving real true scriptures to Indians containing true religion.
So Holwell,
Doe,
Jones,
you can have it with Alexander Doe, Jones,
Doe,
Colin
all of
Brook,
these people believed
right?
that India had some kind of revelation of the one true
Yes.
God. So they were some form of proto-Christian.
Exactly.
people at some point,
precisely, yes.
which degenerated because of the priests.
Exactly.
The priests were corrupt,
Uh-huh.
and this story of the corruption of the priests, you have to understand it again from the perspective of the Catholic Church and their experience,
Right.
the European experience
Right.
with the Catholic Church. But the way we study the Orientalists is that they were scientists, they were philologists, they were experts of various kinds. So, are you saying that they were basically missionaries? What is the difference between them? How would you understand them?
That's more difficult. I don't say they are exactly missionaries. The problem goes deeper. The kind of knowledge produced in Europe that time was so much constrained by biblical framework, by Christian beliefs and all the religious experience, Christian experience of Europe, that they could hardly get out of that framework. So I don't think consciously Jones really wanted to do another branch of theology. I don't think so. But it was really difficult to get out of that framework.
So there were constraints
Constraints.
of Christian thinking that produced this line of thought about India.
Exactly. So he was in many ways, I would say, very honest thinker. But what is the content of our thoughts? Well, where from the concepts? Theoretical concepts. Where from the questions that are guiding the research? You know, research is not just observing. Of course, there was this school of thought in European history which really believed that we are just observing. Our mind is a kind of tabula rasa, it's empty, and then there are some things imprinted on it, and then we somehow generalize out of this experience and we derive knowledge, but that has been rejected. Right? It's clear that the problems we are solving, we are solving, are guided by questions, and these questions are emerging within a particular structures of ideas, frameworks, right? So there, Jones was still very much a deist believer Christian. One true God is the source of morality. He created us. It's all there. And within these constraints, he did all the best to understand what's going on here in India. So I don't think, it's that simple. He just wanted to evangelize India. I don't know. He is in fact saying, leave them. There is something beautiful about it. There is lots of corruption. He is really talking. Introduction to Manu, you have notes about superstition, it's all there. But at the same time, he is saying, there is something beautiful about it. Leave it as it is. These people can't do more. Fine. The problem is, as you are saying, it's not only that you in India believe these were scientists. This is what we believe and are taught in the West. Hardly anybody, in general, when I talk about the number of Orientalists who are teaching and doing research today, among them there are few people who started to look back at the roots of Western Orientalism, and it's a very recent research emerging only. Very few people, and there the critical discussion started. But the general picture, the way I was taught at Indology in Prague, for example, is exactly this. This is this genius, William Jones. He comes, he sees somehow the connection between the languages.
So, Martin, if I understand what you've been saying, the question I posed was that the relevance of India to Europe and Europe to India seems to be shaped, at least in our current textbooks, from the encounter of the 18th, 19th century processes of colonialism. And the story you've told is that it seems as if when Europe begins to study India in this period, what it does is try to look for religion or understand religion, because in the European experience, Christianity, religion is what shaped law, morality, culture, all of these major dimensions of life. And so they're looking to understand India through an understanding of its religion. That impulse takes them to looking for certain kinds of texts, especially because it's as if India is too chaotic. They start looking for particular texts, and especially in the domain of law. William Jones, for instance, becomes successful when he finds the Manusmriti. And he translates that and proposes that that is the Hindu law code. And yet, they have to undergo a further process where they edit out large parts of these texts because they're simply not law. So they looked for and found texts that were religious texts according to them in order to understand law, then edited out large parts of it and replaced it with British law. And of course, this process is combined with many other attempts to understand and look at India. But what happens through this process to the relevance of India to Europe and Europe to India? That part of the question.
This is a very important question, yes. When we talked about the earlier period, ancient period, I stressed the partnership. There could have been hardly other ways how they could really exchange knowledge, but even in trade and diplomacy, the sense given is that Indians and Europeans are on equal footing.
We took each other seriously.
Yeah, we took each other seriously, and there was this kind of respect and sense that we can enrich each other's lives and knowledge, etc. What I see in the material from the late 18th and especially throughout the 19th century is the victory of an idea that there is nothing to learn from India to Europe. We Europeans or our forefathers, they started to think somehow we reached the peak of humankind's development. This is Enlightenment conviction. Many Enlightenment philosophers were convinced that now this is the age of reason. We are reasonably framing even the religion, We are framing the laws of society, French Revolution, American Revolution and the further developments. We want to achieve what neither of the generations beforehand achieved, and it was such a huge shift, even for Europe, that it could hardly leave a space for taking cultures seriously, and religion played a major role. If these heathens are there immersed in their superstitions, what are they to learn for us rational beings? That's one part of the story. Then I would also suggest the nature of colonial rule itself, the British colonial rule, as it developed, was supportive of this idea. Because what British needed from India was what? Raw materials. India was a very rich country. They were so happy to keep India. There are historical studies, P.J. Marshall and other people, who can show how India replaced in the power and trade model of the British Empire the loss of what was become United States of America. So India was a replacement for that. We lost that resource of trade and many other things. So India, let's keep it, let's develop it. And then there you see how this goal shaped all the policy making. It shaped the way they decided about the way how to go about Europe, about Indians. They need raw materials, they needed cheap labor, and of course this makes us the strongest empire in the world, which is true. And then in this newly built connections, you can hardly have a sense of partnership. The subdued people, why should we take them as partners? And of course, second half of the 19th century, it gives even more. It tells you the new racist anthropology developing in Europe. It tells you these are low races, not developed well enough. But it had again predecessors, in the religious evolutionary discussion, which Enlightenment thinkers did. This idea of primitive religion and how it developed. Well, in us, Europe also had a stage of primitive religion, but now we are much further. India more or less kept there. And Islam degenerated more or less to very close what primitive religion was conceived of.
Okay.
So in the eyes of Europe, you have two evolutionary models. One is more religious cultural enlightenment speculations about the development of humankind and the stages that all human societies are going. But basically it was Europe's history and European conviction in reaching a certain peak, and then we go further and let the rest of humankind follow us. And then it was then used and added and developed into the racist anthropology. Right?
So you're calling colonial anthropology a racist anthropology?
Exactly. That is not a secret today. Anthropology in the second half of 20th century did quite a lot to critically look back and get rid of the very clear racism, talking about superiority of certain races and these